Okay, we're ready to go. I want to remind everyone to turn off their cell phones. You can Twitter if you want, that's quieter. You could be the first to give the outside world a view on what Matt Taibbi is saying. I'm Jeff Cohen. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Park Center for Independent Media and the Journalism Department at the Park School of Communications. Our center would not exist if not for Adelaide Gomer and the Park Foundation. Give a little wave, Adelaide. We wouldn't exist if not for Dean Diane Lynch of the Park School. An announcement, 2 nights from now, Wednesday night in this room, John Carlos, the legendary sprinter, will be speaking. He raised his fist at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City for human rights and racial justice. If you're the next time we gather for the Park Center, it will be the first time we give out our annual award for special achievement in independent media. That's the Izzy Award, named after I.F. Stone, the legendary independent journalist and publisher. If you're a Park major and you're interested in interning this summer in the independent media, and you'll know that's the sector of the media that's actually growing and not engaging in mass layoffs, you should see me over the next month or so, or my associate Brandy Hawley. Where's Brandy? There. Because we're interested in placing you in some exciting independent media outlets for the summer. It's a thrill to introduce our speaker. I don't want to waste a lot of time. He's been here meeting with students all day. His work proves that journalism can be humorous and deadly serious at the same time. He knows the value of independent media, having launched a couple independent outlets, or helped to launch a couple independent outlets himself. Like others in the journalism department, I feel like by now I've read most of the collected works of our speaker, not the stuff written in Russian. And what you see is, and he's known for the scathing indictments of the powers that be and their hypocrisy and corruption and deception, but there's also that compassion for the victims of that corruption and deception. And I think it's that old journalist credo about afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. Let's have a warm Ithaca welcome for Matt Taibbi.
Thank you very much. Before I start, first of all, I want to thank very much the Park Center and Ithaca College for your tremendous hospitality in bringing me here today. Professor Cohen and Todd and Vadim and Brandy and all you folks have been wonderful this entire time that I've been here. You've been tremendously hospitable, and it's been a tremendous experience already. And actually, it's a very much a personal honor for me. Professor Cohen doesn't know this, but I lived overseas for many years, and for a lot of that time, my number one source for reading news back in the United States was fair.org. Before I read anything, I would actually read his website, and that contributed a lot to my education about how to look at the American media. In conjunction with not actually living in the United States and having that perspective, seeing the news first through FAIR and then reading the news only afterward was a very, very important part of my development and my education about the United States media. So when I heard when Professor Cohen contacted me about coming up here, it was a great honor, and I'm very happy to be here. It was a tremendous experience also today to meet with a lot of the students in some of the classes at the Park Center. For me, it's both a sad and an inspiring thing to see so many bright, idealistic young people who want to go into the business of journalism. It's inspiring because you all seem so committed to wanting to tell the truth and tell important stories. And it's sad because I know you're about to enter a business that is sometimes only tangentially about telling the truth. That whole part of it becomes only a small part of the equation when you go into this business. And what I mostly want to talk about today is sort of my experience and my sort of struggle to come up against this dynamic, and how everybody who enters this business has to learn to separate the sort of demand to tell the truth from what the business asks you to do. So I have a very unusual career, and I want to sort of get to the background story first. I went to school not far from here at Bard College. I studied lit, which, as most of you know, means I basically prepared for unemployment. I was a supremely naive person. My goal was to be a great novelist, and I thought I would graduate school and instantly start cranking out the next Catch-22. And only later did I realize that nobody had the heart to tell me that that was just not going to happen for me. So I was sort of blissfully naive. I never wanted to go into journalism. But about the only smart thing I did in my college years was study abroad. I went to Russia and studied in St. Petersburg. Actually, it was still Leningrad back then. And eventually, even though my degree is from Bard, I actually finished my credits in Russia. And I realized that upon graduation that I had absolutely no skills, that I was almost completely unemployable. But that the one thing I did know was I spoke a little Russian, and I thought it would be easier for me to get work in Russia than in the United States. So I elected to stay. I was still trying to be a writer, but that career choice lasted about, 6 weeks until my money ran out. And I realized that I had to get a real job. And because I didn't have any other skills, and journalism was sort of my family business. My father's a reporter, a television reporter. My stepmother was a TV reporter. My godparents were reporters. Almost everybody I knew growing up, unfortunately for me, was a reporter. So that was really all I knew how to do. So almost by accident, I kind of ended up in the journalism business. And I ended up with a job at the Moscow Times, which was sort of a straight news daily in the mold of a typical American newspaper. And again, for lack of a better plan, I kind of started off down this road toward a career in what we would call straight news journalism. And I was writing news stories for the paper's news desk. And I didn't get very far down that road, and there were two incidents in particular that showed me that this was probably not the right career choice for me. The first involved my immediate editor in the news desk, who was a guy named Jay Ross. Jay looked like Wilford Brimley. He was a 190-year veteran of the UPI, who the paper had brought in with the express purpose of teaching young bucks like us the ins and outs of proper straight news journalism. And Jay sent me to cover the unveiling of a new portrait in a museum in Moscow, which was entitled something like The Great Democrat or The Democrat. It was a portrait of Boris Yeltsin. And the notion that Yeltsin was a great Democrat by 1995, which is when this was already sufficiently ridiculous that the whole event was already sort of a joke. What made it even funnier was that Boris Yeltsin in reality up close looks like an even drunker version of W.C. Fields with a cauliflower nose and everything. But the artist who painted this portrait, made him look like a cross between Jefferson and Thomas Paine, and he had this kind of heroic look in his eyes. So when the tarp came off the painting, there was this complete hush of embarrassment that went across the entire crowd. Nobody knew what to say. So when I got back to the office, I wrote my lead, and I thought the whole thing was really funny. So the lead I ended up writing was this. It was like the wedding of a death row inmate and a cocktail waitress he met through a prison correspondence program. When the moment of truth arrived, nobody knew what to say. And my editor went crazy. He screamed at me. He said, "You can't make jokes in the news section." I argued with him, and I said there was no way to not make a joke about this scene. This was, objectively, a joke. And he argued back, and he said that if you make a joke about this event, you're making a political statement. And reporters do not make political statements. They are objective. The only time you can make a political statement is in the editorial page, and your hands are not going to get on the editorial page at age 24 or age 25, however old I was. So, sort of to compromise, he said to me, "But you can write it light." And I said, "So I can make it vaguely funny, but not really funny?" And he goes, "Exactly." So I thought, that's weird, that's a strange thing. Then not long after that, while I was working at the Moscow Times, I was also stringing for a number of newspapers. Stringing is basically, you call up some newspaper in a foreign country and you say, "Hey, if you ever need something from Russia, I'm your man," So I was stringing for a British newspaper called the Daily Mail, and they had not been happy with me. I had tried very hard to be a serious news reporter with them, and they were very dissatisfied with my style up until that point. So one day, they called me up on Election Day in 1996, and I thought, this is great. The Daily Mail, a big newspaper in England, wants me to write the big front page story on the election of Boris Yeltsin. This is going to be my big break. And I said, "What do you want?" And they said, "Well, a British pilot was killed in a sport plane accident somewhere on the outskirts of Moscow. So we want you to go out and look at the crash site and give us 300 words about it." And I said, "You don't want anything on the election?" They're like, "What election?" So as it happened, I was really busy with the Moscow Times that day, and I was so fed up with the Daily Mail at that point that I made in retrospect, was kind of a funny decision, but at the time was extremely unethical. I just decided to make the entire thing up. And I sent them a story that was full of color, that the crash was the ghastliest thing seen in the Moscow area for a half a century, that you could smell the burning flesh from miles away, and all this stuff. And I was really laying it on thick. But I dashed it off quick and got it off to them, and then I went back to writing the election story for the Moscow Times. The next day, I got a call from the editor in London, and I thought, here it comes, I'm going to be sacked, And before he even started to say anything, I said, "Listen, I know yesterday's story probably wasn't." He goes, "What are you talking about? It was great. We want more stuff just like that." So I thought, they hate me when I'm honest, but when I'm lying, they love me. There has to be something weird about this whole business. So not long after that, I was in Moscow playing basketball on the street, and I met a Mongolian guy who told me about a thing called the Mongolian Basketball Association. And so I decided to quit my job right then and there and go try out for the NBA. And I could stand here and lie to all of you and tell you that I had some profound ideological objection to the way I was being asked to write in the Moscow Times or for the Daily Mail. But in reality, looking back on it, I only had sort of a vague idea that I wasn't allowed to be funny in my job, or that when I was being funny, I was being dishonest. And I kind of vaguely thought that sucked, and that was really the only reason I quit. I wanted to be a writer, and I thought this is not an interesting way to write. So I quit, and I went to pursue an interesting experience. And then actually my third clue that there was something wrong with this business was when I went to quit my job at the Moscow Times. I went to my editor, who was sort of this unpleasant Australian guy named Jeff Weinstock, and I said, "Hey, I'm quitting a job here to go to Mongolia to play professional basketball in the NBA." And he says, "You're making a huge mistake." And I said, "How could that possibly be?" And he says, "If you really, really try, I know we've had some problems here at the Moscow Times, but if you really stick it out, maybe after 10 or 15 years, you could get a job at some place like the New York Times." And I thought, you want me to not go play pro basketball so that I can have a job at an unfunny newspaper 15 years from now? And he's like, exactly. So after that killed any doubts I had about quitting. And I went to Mongolia, and I got in a train and got there and I tried out for a club called the Ulaanbaatar Mountain Eagles. And just as I thought, it was the coolest experience of all time. I played for a guy who wanted me to drum up interest in the league, so I ended up dyeing my hair before each game and getting into fights, and I ended up being known as the Mongolian Rodman. And I was a celebrity in Mongolia. Everywhere I went, people asked me for my autograph. And it's interesting, the whole backstory to basketball in Mongolia was great to begin with, because what happened was, a few years before I arrived there, the president of the Mongolian Stock Exchange had studied in New York. And while he was a student in Columbia, he had videotaped the entire NBA basketball playoff series. And when he came back to Mongolia, he illegally broadcast all these games on Mongolian television. And they instantly became the highest rated television shows in the history of the country. So within a year, Mongolia was like Indiana. You know, there were basketball hoops in every courtyard, and the guys who were playing basketball professionally, and it was a very low level of basketball, I would say it was like Division II level in America, were enormous, massive celebrities. So, and that was me, and I would never have left. I would have stayed in that life until I couldn't play again anymore, except that I caught pneumonia and nearly died in Mongolia, and I had to leave the country and go back to the United States to convalesce in a hospital. So when I got back, I had an operation, recovered, and I wrote an article for the Boston Globe magazine about my experience in Mongolia, which taught me one thing about this business, which is that no matter who you are, no matter how young you are, no matter how few clips that you have or how few connections you have, if you do something that is super interesting, you know, at least once someone will give you a shot to write something for a big publication. And I know I meet a lot of young journalists who say, how do you break into this business? And the answer is do something cool. That's the easiest way to get in. So anyway, so after that, I got a call from a friend of mine back in Moscow, and he wanted me to help found the newspaper called the eXile. And this was going to be modeled after the old Spy magazine. Does anybody here remember that magazine? It was sort of Spy magazine was sort of a creation of a bunch of guys who were veterans of the news magazine business, like Time and Newsweek, and they wanted to make a sort of anti-magazine. The entire thing was a spoof of what magazines were. And the eXile, what we decided was going to be a spoof of newspapers. So everything that the Moscow Times did, we were going to do exactly the opposite, basically. Everything from the design to the use of language to the editorials, everything. It was sort of an anarchist take on publishing. And again, there were no deep, profound ideological ideas here. This was purely a sophomoric, I don't work in newspapers anymore, so I'm going to do everything backwards kind of approach to the job. But we decided that whatever rules there were in the newspaper business, we were going to break them whether they were good rules or not. Like, for instance, rule number 1 in publishing is that your readers have to be able to understand the publication. And we broke that one by putting out an entire issue in French. Without any warning whatsoever, which led to the breaking of the second rule, which is don't piss off your advertisers for any reason. You know, we had a lot of people coming to us saying, you know, nobody could understand the ad. So we lost thousands and thousands of dollars on that one. Another rule that they have in journalism typically is that whether publications have something to say or not, they put something on the front page. Whether they have a story or not that's interesting, they say they have something interesting to say. Whereas when we didn't have anything to say, we just put nothing on the cover. Like, no headline, nothing. Basically, we spent the last 2 weeks getting stoned and sorry. Tune in next week. You know, another typical rule was that you wanted your readers to recognize the publication. That's why style is consistent. That's why you have the same design from week to week. But we threw that rule out the window too. We changed the title of the publication sometimes. Sometimes I'd be walking down the street, and I was in Russia. I used to collect rare newspapers, so if I saw something like an old Russian newspaper like Kolkhoznitsa, I would decide that I wanted the eXile to look something like that next issue. You know, why Stalin was on the cover, no reason at all. The stuff on the cover very frequently didn't actually lead to a story inside. We would say, you know, exclusive interview with so-and-so, page 3, you'd open up page 3, nothing, it's not there. Another thing that I'd noticed working at straight newspapers in Moscow is that reporters were immensely more interesting when they were sort of standing around with each other bullshitting about what they were going to write about than when they actually wrote their articles. And I was always tremendously interested to listen to reporters when, you know, the people on the news desk or the business desk. But when it came around to reading their actual articles, they were incredibly dry. So we decided we were going to do it the other way, that we were going to write everything that was in the paper in the style that people use when they talk to, reporters use when they talk to each other. So for instance, I knew from experience that American journalists had been writing obituaries for Boris Yeltsin every week since about 1993. And he was constantly drinking himself into a coma and falling ill, and the whole country would have to go on this death watch. And reporters were incredibly frustrated by this whole thing. You know, they would make jokes about it. They would say, oh, I'm writing another Yeltsin is dying story, or hey, you want to get a beer? No, dude, I'm on Yeltsin death watch. I can't do that. But then when it came time to write the story, they'd have to write these somber, oh, Russia awaits the, you know, Yeltsin's recovery, you know, will he get better? But we decided to just cut right to the chase and do die already. Just sort of our approach to the problem there. One of the things that was unique about our situation is that we were in a real legal no man's land. I think it was probably in the whole history of American journalism, no one's been in the situation that we were in. For one thing, the American authorities couldn't reach us through any legal means, and the Russian authorities didn't read us, which was beautiful. Also, we're probably the only publication in the world whose advertisers did not read the publication. Our advertisers are almost entirely Russian club owners, and as long as the ads were in the correct language, they paid us. They never read what was in the actual magazine. So we had almost complete and total freedom. And which meant we didn't have to worry about getting sued or getting arrested or doing anything like that, although that proved not to be true. I'll get to that later. But this came into play in a number of different ways. For instance, while I was working at the eXile, I was also working at a Russian publication called Stringer. I wrote in English and in Russian. And the owner of Stringer was a guy named Alexander Korzhakov, who was a former KGB general and also Yeltsin's bodyguard. He had been Yeltsin's bodyguard. There was actually a brief period in 1996 where he tried to take over the country, believe it or not. And this guy was my boss. Anyway, one night about in the year 2000, I was out drinking with him and the editor of the paper, a guy named Leonid Krutakov. And incidentally, before I even get to that, I would say about 3/4 of the disastrous events in Russia's history have occurred while people were drinking. And this is going to be another one of those. So we were all drunk, and at one point, Korzhakov, the ex-KGB general, says to us, hey, you know, I can wiretap anybody you want, just say the word. So we're all wasted, and Leonid says to him, oh yeah, can you wiretap Putin's chief of staff? And he goes, no problem, see you guys next week. Gets up, walks out of the room, we're like, whatever, we keep drinking. A week later, he comes to us with a stack of CDs. And he says, that'll be $3,000. Leonid didn't have any money at all. He goes, dude, I hope your credit card still has something left in the limit. So we paid the guy, and we just verbatim put a whole week's worth of conversations by Vladimir Putin's chief of staff in both papers, in Stringer and in the eXile. The really funny thing is that Leonid got in tons of trouble. ended up having to leave Russia and go to work in Kazakhstan, and nothing happened to me. So, if you can imagine a situation where, for instance, you could wiretap the White House illegally, announce it on the front page of a publication, and have nothing happen, that's what was basically our situation in Russia. But it wasn't just goofy stuff like that. Well, I guess that wasn't that goofy, but there was a lot of other stuff that we did differently too. I mean, I went into this whole venture with the attitude that this was going to be a gag, but it also turned into a kind of a serious education for me about what journalism was all about and what it wasn't about. And one of the things I started to notice after living in Russia for a while was that American editors in Moscow were always looking for stories to tell about how well American-style capitalism was working in Russia. And so there was this flood of stories that went into the American press about the so-called emerging middle class in Russia. And they would basically send these stories home about how, well, now that there are these American reforms in Russia, everybody's living great, and they've got VCRs and Coca-Cola, and life is good. And just to give you a sample of what those stories were like, here's a quote from Business Week back then. Boosted by a resurgent economy and by its own bootstraps, a middle class is taking root in the former land of the proletariat. Like their Western counterparts, they're a stabilizing force in Russia's economy. Many are plowing their money into their own businesses, creating jobs. Now, I knew most of the people who were writing these stories, and I knew how they worked, and most of the way this worked was the following. The editor would tell the reporter that we wanted a story about the emerging middle class, so they would send the guy to some remote city, and the reporter very often didn't speak Russian, so he brought a helper with him, who did. And he would tell that helper, find me somebody who has a VCR, who takes a vacation in Cyprus once a year, and who drinks a lot of American, soft drinks. They would find that person, do their interviews, and then get out of town. And that was basically the way the story worked. Without getting too pretentious about it, I discovered, was sort of an exaggerated version of how American journalism works in general. Editors decide what story they want ahead of time, then they go out and get it. And I thought that it should be the other way around. I thought that reporters should start with reality and then work their way back to what they were going to say in print. So I decided to do a series of stories where, instead of looking for something ahead of time, I would go to these remote regions of Russia and live the life of the people I was going to write about, and then tell that story later on. So I got jobs in various places working as a clown. I worked in an elephant cage in a zoo. I laid bricks in Siberia. I worked as a laborer in a monastery in central Russia. In the agricultural villages, I made and sold moonshine, which is a very big way of making money in the villages. I spent a month going to a high school in the ghetto in Moscow. I went down in a coal mine. I worked as a security guard. I did all these things. And what I discovered when I did all these stories was that these tales of the emerging middle class were way off base. And the Russia of my experience was a place where, despite the fact that there were some good things happening, for the most part, things were getting drastically worse. For instance, the guys I worked construction with in Siberia had salary delays of up to 6 months. And in a lot of places like that place, people were not even paid in money at all. They were paid in credits to a store owned by the company. So once a week, the guys that I was working with didn't have a paycheck. They would get to a bunch of coupons, or talonni they called them, and they would have to go to a store that the company owned, and they would buy a sack of rice and a big jug of vodka and some milk, and that's how they lived. It was de facto slavery or indentured servitude, really. So, and this I saw not just in one place, but I saw it above the Arctic Circle. I saw it in central Russia. I saw it in the villages where people were so starved for money that they actually used this moonshine as currency in a lot of places. And I started to notice that there was this vast disconnect between the Russia that actually existed and the Russia that American reporters were telling audiences back home existed. And when I saw how huge that difference was, I began to understand that I started to think for the first time about the politics of American journalism. And I started to understand that newspaper editors aren't just strict about what kind of language you can use because they don't have a sense of humor, and they don't have a rigid design format or write boring editorials just because they lack creativity. The stylistic rigidity of mainstream journalism in this country is actually more important than that. It's a reflection of its sort of inner ideological character. Newspapers aren't just stylistically rigid, they're ideologically rigid, and the format that they're being asked to use is a reflection of that. One of the most common complaints I got about the eXile back then was, you can't be ridiculous and serious at the same time. And I'd ask why that was the case, and they'd say, well, that's just not how it's done, reporters would tell me. They would say to me, if you're absurd one day and serious the next, people will get confused. They won't know when you're being serious. They won't be able to figure out which is which. And I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, people are serious one day and joking the next. You might come home one day and your wife jokes about the ugly shirt you're wearing, and the next day she's mad that you didn't take out the trash, and you certainly don't get confused in that situation. Why would you get confused about a newspaper? People aren't stupid. But it's true, actually, in American journalism, that's the way they do it. They compartmentalize everything. And, you know, the model for journalism in this country is sort of like 60 Minutes. It's serious and serious and serious, and then at the end you have 3 minutes of Andy Rooney complaining about fridge magnets and the toner and Xerox machines, and you know, you have your serious part here and your sense of humor stays in a little cage over here, and that's the way they do things in this country. But reality isn't like that. You know, real life is tragic, it's funny, it's uplifting, it's corrupt, it's horrible, and it's all these things all at once. And my approach to all this was that if you don't portray it that way, you're somehow distorting reality. And I didn't really understand how they distorted reality in our system, but I knew they were distorting it. So, you know, I started to think about what I had learned in mainstream American journalism and what was really going on. And it occurred to me that this emotionally neutral, objective tone you're supposed to use in places like the Moscow Times is actually used to conceal all sorts of things, all biases and propaganda. In American journalism, the tone is everything. You know, if you read a story like "The world is on fire, flee," they tell you can't do that. You know, it's alarmist. You have to go back and do it some other way. Like, firefighters expressed concern today that the world was on fire, and you know, and it sounds like a very small difference, but it really isn't. It's really important. And that's when I really finally understood what had actually happened to me with Jay Ross, my editor at the Moscow Times that day. In American journalism, when you agree with your editors, you're allowed to express yourself at full volume. Like, if you really think it's a big story that Bradulina's photos of their kid was just released, they're going to let you run with those emotions as much as you want. But if you have some other kind of view on the news, they want you to kind of tell it in a muted way. They want you to write it light or signal what your true feelings about the subject in some way that's not direct. And on the campaign trail in America, you see this all the time. How many people here read a lot of campaign news stories? You ever notice words like professorial or patrician or bookish or anything like that? Anybody ever see those words? I mean, that's what the reporters are really trying to tell you when they use words like that, is that they think the candidate is elitist or that he's not fit to be, you know, the representative of the ordinary guy. And then they'll turn around and they'll say, you know, America's looking for a candidate they want to have a beer with, but that's also code for something else. They're trained in this country to not say what they really mean. Or, for instance, the word nuanced. You ever noticed that word before? They use that for John Kerry a lot. Nuance in reality just means this person does not have any fixed position on anything, but it's usually used as a positive adjective in campaign journalism. And this violates really every rule of writing. In writing, you're trained to kind of speak as directly as possible using the clearest imagery at your disposal. If you see some person and you think he's full of shit, you say, this person is full of shit. You don't say he's measured in his opinions, But that's the way they teach you to write in American journalism. And so, what you have to understand is that the goals of American newspaper reporting are very different than the goals that you would have if you were simply trying to write well. And before I cared anything about politics, this is what I cared about, that American newspaper writing is almost by definition bad writing, because good writing, there's only one voice, and it has to be the writer's own voice. In newspaper writing, you're writing with somebody else's voice, and you're writing somebody else's opinions. And this, by definition, cannot be good writing. It may be good newspaper journalism, but it can't be good writing. Anyway, all of these, mainstream newspaper journalism is all about telling the truth within a certain context, within a fixed set of assumptions and cultural prejudices. Your job is to push a version of reality within parameters. You're allowed to be outrageous, but not too outrageous. You're allowed to be funny, but not too funny. And the goal of all of this is sort of to reinforce the attitudes of the status quo, to continually push readers back to the sort of familiar, safe mental space where they can expect that there won't be any surprises, where they won't be challenged or offended, and they won't be asked to think outside their comfort zone. And in the same way that they're trained not to expect that there'll be any jokes in the front page, they're trained to expect that there won't be any anti-war candidates running for president who'll be taken seriously. They're sort of trained to pick up on all these subtle mental cues about how they're supposed to think. And it's a subtle thing, and once you've been in the business for a dozen years or so, you don't even notice it anymore. You internalize it, and you sort of adopt these values for yourself. Anyway, I'm not going to stand up here and say that that newspaper writing is inherently bad, but I just want everybody who's going into this business to be aware that this is the reality, and that if you go into the commercial journalism world, you're going to be asked to write a certain way and to adopt certain opinions, and to adopt all these values. And you have to constantly struggle against that in order to maintain your own individuality and your own voice. But one of the things that's important is that if you want to do things differently, you can. I mean, what you have to make the decision early on in your career about whether you want to be a reporter or a writer. And if you want to be a writer, you are absolutely free to do that. You can do what I did, which is basically just, write your own newspaper and hand it out in the street corner, or now there's the internet, where anybody can be a writer. But you just have to be prepared that it's going to be a long, hard road, that it's going to not pay very well, and that there's going to be a long period of not getting any financial reward for any of that. But what you will learn after a while is that if you tell the truth to people, they will come back for it, because they prefer that sort of unscrubbed, unsanitized version of reality that I saw other reporters talking about with each other, for instance. People prefer that reality, that sort of raw, truthful approach, and they can sense that there's something untrue about the commercial journalism. And if you can give them that alternative, they will come back to it, and you'll have that audience. Boy, this has turned really hokey really fast. I'm sorry. Anyway, I just wanted to say that when I was in college, I always hated it when people came to school and gave you those hokey speeches about how you have to be yourself and stand up for yourself. But in this business, actually, that does have some value. You have to really, really work hard and fight hard to have your own voice. And it's important that you do that, because As we've all seen, that when you give in to the sort of popular deceptions about, for instance, the Iraq War or the financial bubble, it doesn't serve anybody's interests. It's more important for you to tell the truth, and it's also more interesting and more entertaining. So it's possible, and I hope you all pursue that as a goal if you go into the journalism business. And I'm going to mercifully bring this speech to an end and take questions right now, if that's possible.
If you want to ask questions, make comments, come to the mic here. Start lining up. You have to keep the question or comment short. You can ask it in English or Russian. And I wanted to say, as people, if you have to leave, there are books, 3 recent books that Matt has written over the last few years on sale. If you stick around, he will sign them. So let's start with questions or comments.
How's it going?
All right.
All right. I'm from Niagara Falls, so I understand the importance of the Buffalo Beast in the Western New York culture and community, and how funny it is. It's pretty good. But my question is, it's actually kind of like a quick 2-part question. What is your involvement with the Buffalo Beast currently? None? Okay.
I mean, I'm in touch with those guys, but.
All right. And after the whole Tom Cruise fiasco, there's kind of a lot of national exposure that came from that. And do you think that they're still gaining momentum or sustaining that momentum from that situation?
Well, the Beast has a terrible problem, which is that it's an alternative newspaper in America. And, the alternative newspaper market is basically dead. The reason for that is that the commercial base for those publications has been completely undercut. In the old days, alternative biweeklies or weeklies survived almost entirely on real estate ads or sex ads or personals or help wanteds, and all those things have moved to the internet. So there's no natural way to make money doing those kinds of publications anymore. So the Beast doesn't make money and can't pay anybody to really work there, so it's constantly going to have to be this kind of threadbare operation. I was lucky in Russia that I had a captive audience, and we were really one of only 2 English language media outlets in town. So all these Russian club owners, when they wanted to reach Western audiences, they had only 2 choices, us or the Moscow Times. That sort of artificially gave me confidence that I could repeat the formula here in the United States, and I found out in about 8 months that that's not true, and lost all my money in the process. But the Beast, I think, is gradually sort of transitioning to more of an internet existence, and that's where all of the alternative media is going to be in the future. I think that trying to put out a print publication has dragged them down, and has become, it's also just logistically difficult. I don't know how many people here have actually tried to put out a print publication with just a couple of people on a regular basis. I mean, you'll go nuts or become a speed addict really quickly if you go that route. So I think that, and their future as an internet publication is probably brighter than as a print publication.
Thanks.
They have the 50 most loathsome Americans list. And Tom Cruise was in that, and I forget what it is they wrote about him, but he has, I guess he has a staff of people who comb through the internet looking for stuff they can sue people about. So they went after the Beast, and it was, the Beast doesn't, although the fact, it's actually published by a lawyer, but he's like the worst lawyer in the world. So they were completely helpless against Tom Cruise. But he eventually went away, is what happened. He just stopped pursuing that lawsuit when he found out there was no money to be won. So.
What's your favorite Johnny Depp movie? Midnight.
Ed Wood.
At what?
Yeah, yours?
Dead Man.
Which one?
Dead Man.
Don't know that one.
You ought to see it.
Okay.
Black and white, 95, I think.
All right, I will.
Watch that
Excellent.
movie.
How's it going, Matt?
All right.
Good. I read in your biography about your experience as a Russian and Uzbekistani baseball player, and I'm really curious about your experience as the Mongolian rodman. That sounds hilarious. What do you think the role of sports is in American journalism and American culture, I guess in Mongolian culture as well?
Well, sports is very important in all cultures. I mean, I think, and especially in American culture, what's really interesting about sports in American culture is like it's one of the few honest things you see on TV. You know, that the game isn't rigged at all. Well, it's only a little bit rigged anyway, and I think that's why people are so attracted to it. You know, I had great experiences playing sports in foreign country. That's one of the ways that people who, when you have a language barrier, one of the easiest ways you can connect with other cultures is through something like sports or music. In Uzbekistan, when I played baseball, this is really funny. We played our games in a pasture, and we had ground rules that if you hit a sheep, it was a triple, and a cow, it was a double. And we only had one opponent. It was Kyrgyzstan, and our team was actually me, 8 Cubans, and 1 Uzbeki guy, and that was the Uzbek national baseball team. It was a hilarious experience, but you know, and it's great for when you're doing journalism, you have to use whatever you can to kind of connect with the subject matter that you're writing about, and that was one of the things that really helped me when I was overseas, is that it was sports.
You also made a lot of comments about the American news media. I wonder if you had any comments about the American sports media.
Well, sports, journalism is actually more interesting than news journalism, because you have so much more freedom to be stylistically different in sports journalism. I mean, the goal of it is to be entertaining and to be colorful. They're not trying to make you be anything else. And so I really enjoy writing about sports. I think almost everybody who covers sports really likes it in this country. It's obviously has its ridiculous aspects, and when you get guys like Jay Mariotti going, completely nuts about some guy who took steroids a million years ago, like it's the end of the world or something like that. This is obviously completely ridiculous, but there are many aspects of American culture that are ridiculous, and I think it's probably lower down the totem pole than some of the other ones. So.
Hey Matt, this question tends more to the practical end of the spectrum, but as I understood it, only the offsprings of the rich and famous get to write for Rolling Stone. How'd you get your foot in the door?
Well, that's not me. No, I mean, I think Rolling Stone did a story about the eXile when I was in Russia. They sent over this guy, Brian Preston, who was an expert on marijuana, and we could tell this because he was high the entire time he was there. And we actually got him converted to other drugs while he was in Moscow, and sent him back to Rolling Stone, a complete mess. And I think he actually never really recovered from that. In fact, his career kind of didn't go anywhere after that. So, but the editors, as a result of that story, knew us. And when I came back to the States in 2003 or 2002. They saw something that I'd written either in the Beast or the New York Press, and one of the editors called me in and asked me to cover the presidential campaign in 2004. So that's how I got in there.
Nice. Alter their perspective then.
Alter
their perspective then.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, they're. Yeah, I don't know what their reasoning was, but
nice.
It worked out.
Hi. In your most recent book, The Great Derangement, you spent a considerable amount of time in Texas doing the born again Christian thing, and I'm thinking in particular of the woman Lori when I'm asking this question. But you spent so much time there developing these relationships with people, and then there came a time where you had to leave Texas. How does that work in undercover journalism? Do you still keep in contact with them, or do you just kind of disappear completely?
Most of the time, no. Obviously, I talked to this about this with some of the classes today. Ethically, undercover journalism is very dicey, and even today, I'm not sure how I feel about it. In order to do it, you have to befriend the people you're writing about. You have to bring them into your confidence, and the entire time that you're going to betray them in the end somehow. So, this is a very dark, dark thing, and only a certain person is capable of doing it. I think. I struggled with it a lot. The first time I really had problems with that was when I did the story for Rolling Stone where I went undercover in the Bush campaign. in 2004, and I actually ended up managing an office of the Bush campaign in Florida, and I'm sad to say we actually kicked ass in that district, and I may have helped deliver the election to Bush inadvertently. But during that whole experience, I had to befriend everybody that I was working with, and it was really when it came out, there were a lot of really hard feelings on it on all sides. I got a lot of really angry phone calls, and there was one person who sued me. And I don't know what to say. I mean, anytime you're going to do a story like that, obviously undercover journalism is less obviously problematic when it's something like trying to uncover a crime or corruption. But when it's just cultural journalism, like what I was doing, it's very problematic ethically. But I think in the end, it's probably a net plus, but maybe just barely. So.
First off, I want to apologize. Earlier today, at about noon, I came into the little lounge and park, and there were sandwiches set up, and you were there. There was like 6 other people in the room, and I didn't really say hi, and I feel bad about that. So
That's
I apologize.
okay. I absolve you.
Thank you. Well, hello. I'll say hello now.
All right, hello.
So you mentioned your dad earlier, and he has spent his career in commercial journalism.
Right.
I think he's on Morning Joe like 3 times a week or something.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, but I'm just curious if you've had any conversations with him about journalism, some of the concerns you've expressed, and about commercial journalism, and if
Sure.
he said anything about that.
I mean, my father and I have had a lot of discussions about it. I think on the whole, he has always been enormously supportive of the stuff that I've done. I think he wouldn't choose to do things that way himself, but he was always very supportive of me. He, I think on some level, is a little bit envious of the freedom that we had at the eXile. And his job has gotten more and more difficult, I think, over the years. Although he actually hasn't said that to me, but journalism has changed quite a lot over the years, especially television journalism. And it's a very tough job. And in fact, I've only recently recognized, I had this experience where I worked for the Bill Maher show a little bit. Only after that did I realize how tough it is to actually go on the air every day and do all that stuff. But I think there's a place for both kinds of journalism, but the direction that it's going in now, it's increasingly difficult for people who are doing that kind of work for those big news organizations. I'll give you an example. I know a news reporter who did a crime story about a group of people in rural Georgia, and there was a murder in this little town. And all the people who that he was interviewing were basically poor Georgian sort of farmer types. And he cut the whole piece, and he interviewed all these people, and it was a good, interesting piece. But he brought it to his news editor, and the news editor says, hey, we can't have all these poor hicks on TV. We want you to recut all those interviews, and instead of having them talk, we want you to do stand-ups. Because TV, this is probably little known to people who aren't in the business, but they actually don't like to show images of poverty on television because it tends to have a negative influence on advertising. When people see depressing scenes, when they see scenes about poverty, they buy less. So TV stations try to have fewer poor people on TV, not so much because of their ideology, just because they're greedy, and that's the way the business works. And this is a very frustrating position for reporters to be in, and they have to face that kind of pressure every single day. And so it's a very tough job, and I don't envy the people who have to do it, I think. And I admire people who manage to get something positive out of it.
Hi, Matt.
Hi.
I wanted to know a little bit about some of the writers who inspired you, and also about your approach to style.
Style. Well, again, I wanted to be a fiction writer, so all my favorite writers were all novelists for the most part when I was growing up. I went to Russia because my favorite writer was a guy named Nikolai Gogol. I also, I liked all the Russian writers. There were Mikhail Zoshenko, Bulgakov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. That's why I went over there. I wanted to learn how to read these people in Russian. And later on, I started to get into some other people too. I mean, I read, Catch-22 was a big book in my life. Evil and Wah, Saki. Has anyone here ever read Saki? Wow, no. Okay. Very funny British short story writer. I highly recommend anything that he's written. And then there were sort of some individual pieces that have kind of been influence on how I've approached some things. Like, has anyone ever read Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses? It's a piece by Mark Twain where he writes about James Fenimore Cooper, the guy who wrote The Deerslayer, and he basically just rips this guy for like 4,000 consecutive words, and it's like the most beautiful thing that I've ever read in my entire life. So that was sort of where I learned a lot about how, you know, being really nasty and targeting somebody can be funny and can be entertaining from that. But you know, specifically, what about style? What exactly are you asking?
That's a good question. I was thinking about that myself. The things you write are alternately sometimes terse and a little bit more ornate. I mean, are there any writers that you really emulate when you sit down and put pen to paper?
No, I mean, I think when all writers, when they're young and they're coming up, they copy everybody. I mean, I think that's sort of the way that writers learn how to write, is that you try out, does this guy's style work for me? Does this guy's style not work for me? You know, when I learned pretty early, you know, that when I tried to be deep and profound like Tolstoy, it came out completely stupid and pretentious, and it didn't really work. And when I tried to be funny, sometimes it did work, you know, like some of the other writers, like Saki, for instance, or, you know, Joseph Heller or somebody like that. Or Woody Allen was another guy I read a lot of. You know, his short stories were hilarious. So you sort of try on all these different hats when you're young. And then hopefully by the time you're old enough, it kind of seamlessly turns into this one big patchwork where you take bits and pieces from this person and that person and use this person's phrases and that person's approach to, you know, structure and that sort of thing. And so I think every writer sort of finds that for himself.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. One is, how bad is it for your career to be sued for sidestepping ethical boundaries?
For sidestepping what?
Like ethics and
Oh.
as far as journalism goes. And do you know anything about war reporting, or have you covered any wars or battles or feuds or stuff like that?
Well, I hope you're not referring to me about the getting sued for ethical reasons. I've been sued before, but not for ethical issues. You know, that's deadly. Obviously, you cannot be caught making stuff up or, you know, being libelous. I mean, the kind of thing that somebody like Stephen Glass got caught for, or Jason Blair. You just can't really recover. Well, actually, that's not true in America. There are second acts in American life now. And, you know, you can become a celebrity of a different kind after you've been, you know, humiliated enough in your first business. But you cannot recover from that kind of thing. And you know, ultimately it is just not worth it. I think there are a lot of reporters. There are probably more reporters than you think out there who cut corners. I know when I worked in Moscow, there were a lot of people who were doing what we call quote massaging. You know, like they would need their man in the street quote from the story about the Russian provinces, and instead of actually going out and get it, they would make it up and attribute it to Ilya Popov, and there's like, you know, 50 of those guys in every town. So how can you fact check that, you know? That goes on an awful lot, you know, and I think a lot of reporters use it as a way to save time, but you can't bounce back for that if they catch you, so don't do it, you know? That's my don't do drug speech, yeah, basically.
Добрый день.
Добрый день.
I can ask you in Russian, but I don't think.
A good point. I think a lot of people think that funny is funny, and you should just make a joke regardless of the consequences. And that's certainly the way we looked at it at the eXile. I mean, we did stuff that was like beyond tasteless and beyond stupid and beyond pointless at the eXile. But you know, you have to, I guess, preserve a little bit of dignity, you know, for government and for society. And that, but in reality, though, if you pick on somebody and they don't deserve it, it's not going to be funny, you know. So that's the standard. I think, you know, I was talking to a class this morning. Somebody asked me why I had covered the campaign in New Hampshire in a gorilla suit, which I did once. And I said, well, because it was silly, you know. I think if the question is why don't you cover it in a gorilla suit is the real question. But if there was something exalted and noble about the presidential campaign, me showing up in a gorilla suit and making fun of it wouldn't have been funny and wouldn't have been a good story to write. So I guess the answer is there is a time when you shouldn't make a joke, but you can just sort of figure that out by asking yourself the question, is this funny or not? And if it's funny, don't do it, you know.
I haven't read your work, so I really don't know the answer to this question. How would you compare your work with the work of, say, Ann Coulter? Are there substantive differences? Is it
God,
sort of the
so.
same, just for a different team? Is there a reason to have you come visit us rather than her, other than our political preferences? I mean, substantively, as it regards journalism.
There are people who ask that question, and honestly, you know, I had a moment in my career, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, where I was getting a lot of calls from people saying, hey, we want you to whip ass on this guy, and can you assassinate this person, and can you write something nasty about this person? And that was the only work I was getting. It was like every time somebody wanted to really stomp on somebody in print, I was the guy they were calling. And I was really worried that that was going to be my life for the rest of eternity. I was going to turn into some kind of alternate universe version of Ann Coulter, you know, only not in a skirt. And but you know, I think to answer your question, I hope not. That's not what I do. I mean, I do some of that stuff where I do a little bit of picking on people, but I also do some investigative reporting. And, you know, I try to do a whole variety of things, and I also make a point of not being exclusively on the left or on the right. I think, you know, the reporting that I do tends to cut both ways quite a lot, because I think it's boring when you have a reporter and you know what his opinion on a subject is going to be ahead of time. I think when people are conditioned to expect that this reporter is going to have the consistently liberal point of view on this, and that person is going to be from the right on this, you're not really I think it's not honest, and I think it's boring. So I try to not be that kind of person, that partisan.
Hi, Matt. Excuse me. You kind of hit me where it hurts tonight. I teach all that traditional journalism.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I don't write that way.
Uh-huh.
I do teach the inverted pyramid.
Uh-huh.
You know, don't use very and really, and what should I be teaching instead?
That's a good question, and that's a fair question. Look, obviously it's not inherently bad necessarily, and there's a lot of great journalism that's been done in that style. You know, if you read Woodward and Bernstein, for instance, you know, they didn't exactly use a whole lot of adjectives or develop character when they were writing their stories, and those were critically important stories in our country's history, and you know, you wouldn't change a word of any of that stuff. But it doesn't have to be done that way. You know, in Russia, when I was there, Russian investigative reporters and Russian news writers are allowed to write on the front page with style. They're allowed to write in the first person, and the theory there is that people will trust a reporter more if they have some kind of sense of what he's like, if the person's upfront about his biases, if you know where his opinions are coming from, and when he gives his facts, if he's giving you these facts because he has a negative opinion about this politician. If you know that ahead of time, that has some value. I like that system better. I like it for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think it's more honest, and number two, it's much more interesting to read. You know, those reporters than, you know, the front pages of our journalism for the most part. And I also think it's much easier to see where the publication is coming from when the people are allowed to write sort of in a human style and in a human colloquial style. When it's in that kind of emotionally neutral tone, it's, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's subtle that you have to really work to figure out what they're trying to say exactly. So I understand that that's the way we do things in this country, and that it's probably not going to change, and that if you have students who are going to go into the journalism world, they do need to know how to do it, or else they're not going to get a job. I just think that, in a better world, there's probably another way to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.
I kind of two-part question. You've been compared a lot to Hunter S. Thompson. Should I stop now?
No, that's okay.
Is that a comparison you endorse, or is that something you kind of try to keep a distance from? And second part is, do you see more of a future for that style of journalism based on what you said, the kind of rough around the edges, personal experience style?
Sure. To answer the first part of your question, as I was saying to the class this morning, I totally understand where that comes from. I mean, I actually have Hunter Thompson's job, so we're both guys who write, we're both humorists who write in the first person and have openly admitted to having drug histories, and we cover the presidential campaign, and we're both balding, so, it's going to be pretty easy to make that comparison, but in reality, Hunter Thompson's writing was vastly more ambitious than my writing was. I think his articles were really more like, that writing was sort of more like great fiction. He had three-dimensional characters, sort of a supercharged narrative story when he wrote them, and his entire body of work was almost like a novel in itself with him as the main character. I mean, I think his sort of journey through American life was kind of like a classic comic story like Kafka, for instance, where here's this guy who's an outsider who's trying desperately to fit in somehow in the world, and the world is just not cooperating, and so there's this tension, this constant comic tension, and the way he did it was beautiful, it was original, it was hilarious, and I think, we haven't seen another guy like that. What I do is really much more, and, I'm embarrassed to say it, I'm more like sort of a glorified Art Buchwald, I kind of do observations of, of current events with little one-liners here and there. And, maybe stylistically a little bit, there's some of that there, but in terms of what the narrative actually is and what's really in the story, I'm very far from doing that. To the second part of your question, is there going to be more of that? I think the internet is going to allow more people like that to flourish. I'm hoping anyway. And I think one of the things a lot of reporters are talking about these days is that the old commercial model is dying away. It used to be that reporters, in order to get paid, they had to work for big organizations, big magazines, big newspapers, and those people went out and sold ads and sold newsstand copies, and they were sort of the middlemen who collected the money and paid the writer. I think with the internet, the audiences are going to come directly to the writer, and the writers are going to make their money directly through advertising sales that come on their internet sites, and there's not going to be that middleman. And so there are going to be people who are going to flourish just because they're good, just because they're good writers, they're going to attract audiences and they're going to make a living. And it's much, much harder to do that in the old system, in the system that we have now. So I think once that system is established and people are able to sort of find their audiences on their own and make a living doing it, we're going to see more of these creative writers come up. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Howdy, I have read your work, and it seems like the congressional reporting you've done is just by far some of the best that genre I've ever read, probably ever. And I was curious if maybe you could do a little bit of that tonight and tell us what your opinions are on the Congress and the stimulus package and what's kind of going on. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm actually, the next story that I'm writing is a lot of it's about TARP and about the bailouts and about the stimulus package. And, anytime you get massive amounts of government spending and Congress involved, there are going to be shenanigans, and there's going to be stuff that you're disappointed in. And in this case, I think it's really no different. I mean, I was talking, for instance, to an analyst from the New York Fed a little while ago, and he was telling me that he had done an analysis that the 2005 bankruptcy bill was causing an additional 32,000 foreclosures a month, because of the bill that was passed back in 2005 basically made it In the old days, if you had a lot of credit card debt, you could declare bankruptcy, get out from under your credit card debt, and keep your house, keep your mortgage. Now you can't do that. You have to pay your credit card debt along with your mortgage. And because of that burden, people are losing their houses and they're paying off their credit cards. It's ridiculous. And that was a bill that came about, I mean, Republicans voted for it, but an awful lot of Democrats voted for it too. And this report came out in the Fed in the middle of December, and there were a few Democrats who decided that they wanted to try to make a change and attach it to the stimulus bill and they basically said, look, here's this one small thing that we did in Congress a few years ago that had a disastrous effect on an immediately urgent crisis that's happening right now. And all we have to do is stick this little thing in the bill and change that one rule, and we can reverse that problem. And they didn't do it. I think they haven't completely closed the door on that, but they've decided that they're not going to make that change. And again, the really depressing thing about this stuff is that you don't hear about it. You only hear about these gigantic spending bills and the broad strokes, and there's really nobody out there who's doing that kind of reporting about what the nuts and bolts are of these bills. And I think people are, if they knew exactly what was going on, if they knew what was happening and what wasn't happening, they'd be a lot angrier, and they might put more pressure on their congressman to get something done. So we're not seeing that, and that's too bad. Yeah, I did do a thing in Iraq a couple of years ago. I spent a couple of months there. I was with an MP unit, and I was talking about this today at a luncheon. Somebody asked me about the embedding process, and I said that this was one of the great regrets of my career, that I was duped by that whole system. The embedding system is kind of designed to make reporters bond with the soldiers who they're with. And what happened with me is that I got stuck with a bunch of these poor kids from Oklahoma who were extremely funny. They were great kids. They really took great care of me. They risked their lives to make sure that I was safe. And I hung out with them for 2 months, and I ended up being so impressed by their story that I looked at the war from I spent almost all my time writing about them and how cool they were, and almost no time writing about the war that I'd seen. And that's the way the embed system works. It's designed specifically to trick idiots like me into not writing about what happens overseas, and it's kind of unfortunate, but that is the system that we have, and there's really no other safe way that I know to do it. I know some guys do it, but the percentage of people who get killed or seriously injured doing it any other way is so high that we just don't have a whole lot of anti-war reporting anymore, and that's really unfortunate.
Hi, I was just wondering how much freedom you have at a publication the size of Rolling Stone in terms of freedom to choose what pieces you're going to do, and then also creative freedom while you're writing those pieces.
Again, this is another thing we covered in the class this morning too. Rolling Stone is kind of a unique organization in that it's a big media organization, but it's wholly privately owned by an individual, which means that we don't have the normal pressures that a corporate media organization would have. I mean, somebody like NBC or CBS or any other big corporate media news organization, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to get as much profit as they can, which means they have to be shallow and stupid, and or they think they do. They have to put Britney Spears in the lead of their news hour and all that stuff. We're not a corporation, so Rolling Stone gives us some leeway to cover unusual topics and to take sort of unusual approaches to politics. We're allowed to have our own opinions about things. I'm allowed to use bad language. I'm allowed to use humor. I'm allowed to do all these things, but it's not the same thing as having total freedom. I mean, in every big commercial organization, there's pressure to try to make money, and in our company, the way that expresses itself is that I'm not allowed to choose the subjects that I cover. So, for instance, when I was in Russia, I was writing almost exclusively about, farmers or, construction workers or high school students. And for Rolling Stone, I have to do stuff like cover, it's always got to be some famous politician that I'm writing about, Obama or McCain or, the big bill in Congress. So there's that big difference, and that's a difference, and it's a big difference. But for the most part, it's a great situation, I would say.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering how you would critique your own work, and what are you trying to change or improve here as you move forward?
Well, I think the obvious thing is that I don't, I don't break enough news. I'm kind of not a very good investigative reporter. I hate phone calls. The best reporters I know, and this includes my father, by the way, who I grew up with. My father used to have a thing he called phone attack, which was every day he came home from work and he would sit there with his Rolodex, and he would just call people for no reason, whether he was working on a story or not. He would just start calling up people in various organizations and, who worked in government and chatting with them. And you have to do that. That's the way this business works. You have to constantly be massaging your sources and expanding your sources and hanging out and doing all that stuff. And I am too lazy to do that stuff. I hate making new friends. I hate talking to people. I really like watching baseball at home. So if I have a choice between watching a ball game and doing that stuff, unfortunately, I do the ball game way too often. So, I try. I think, that if there's one place I'm trying consciously to improve, it's in that area, in developing sources. But I've had some trouble with that. I did much better with it in Russia than I did here because I was on the same beat all the time in Russia, but in this place I'm covering something completely different every 2 weeks, and it makes it very hard to sort of develop that Rolodex. So that's definitely my weak spot, and I wholly admit to that right up front.
You mentioned tonight, and you mentioned earlier today at the luncheon, a lot of the benefits of moving to the internet for people who are investigative journalists or who are more writers. But what are some of the drawbacks that you see about moving to the internet, and some of the benefits of having progressive independent news media in print?
Good question. There are a lot of drawbacks to internet journalism, and that's a really easy question to answer. The biggest thing is that there's no fact-checking. If you're writing for your own blog, you don't have to go through that rigorous process of making sure that double-checking that everything's true. A lot of people do it, or they say they do it, or they provide links to their research, but that's not the same thing as checking, and that's not the same thing as being sure that it's true. And one of the negative ways that influences journalism as a whole is that if something's a big enough phenomenon on the internet now, the mainstream news organizations will feel a responsibility to pick it up somehow. So for instance, does everybody remember back in 2004 when the Bush-Kerry debate and there was that bulge in Bush's jacket and everybody thought it was a transmitter or something like that? Well, this started out as an internet story, and it was never sourced properly. They never found any documentation that this was that he was actually receiving messages from Karl Rover from outer space or wherever. But there were enough rumors about it that the New York Times actually did a front page story about the internet phenomenon about this story, which was a complete end run around the whole fact-checking process. It's a way of subverting the factual standard that we have in newspaper journalism. And it's going to eventually have this corrosive effect where the standard is going to completely erode. I'm convinced of that. Because, no matter how many times you sue people, they're just going to look for the easy way out every time. So that's bad. And then, the good thing about print, and one of the things that was great for me, is that if you have the experience of trying to put a publication out all by yourself, you see the entire landscape of this business. You learn how it works from the advertising standpoint, from the technical aspect of actually putting things on paper, to distribution, to all of that stuff. And when you have experience in all those areas, you understand better how journalism works as a whole, and you're able better to be a journalist, even if you're just writing. I think that's very valuable experience. And what we have instead now with the net is you have all these people who just kind of like pull stuff, from where and stick it on the net, and then they go back to watching TV, and that's not really the same thing as media, in the traditional sense of the word. So I hope it does survive in some form or another.
I'm wondering if there are any female authors or female journalists that you read or you're interested in reading, or that you could steer people towards who are maybe doing some interesting things, and if you could also speak on female journalists in general, like coming from a white male privileged, you know what I mean, this kind of background.
Sure.
And looking at the kinds of advantages you may have had, like sitting in a bar in Russia drinking with people and getting like your story, and how that would maybe never happen for a female journalist, or if it would, or if there are people out there doing that sort of thing that you know of.
When I was in Russia, there were, again, for a variety of reasons, there's more of a tradition of female journalists in Russia, the same way that there's more of a tradition of female doctors in Russia. Just that I think that, during the war, and after the war, there was a tremendous shortage of men in all the professions in Russia. So there were a lot more female journalists than there probably are in American journalism, maybe not even today, but certainly 15, 20 years ago. And a lot of the people that I knew and were colleagues of mine back then were female journalists. One of them you might have heard of was a woman named Anna Politkovskaya, who ended up getting killed over in Russia for, she was writing about Russian corruption, and she ended up getting shot to death. And that was, I didn't know her that well, but, I knew her, and that was very unfortunate. Obviously, I was talking about this with another student today. Female journalists, particularly abroad, have it much harder than men do, because particularly in the third world, if you're going to go cover someplace like Afghanistan or something like that, it's dangerous for women. And but there are a lot of female journalists who I know who've just decided that they're going to overcome that one way or the other. You might know somebody named Carlotta Gall. She's a reporter for the New York Times. I don't agree with her about a lot of things, but she is a very, very tough lady who managed to be a war correspondent in Chechnya and Afghanistan for years and years and years. And she just decided that she was going to overlook the risks and just do it. So there are risks, but it's not always safe for male journalists either in a lot of these places overseas. So. And I think also in American journalism, even though it's traditionally very much a male-dominated business, and I think it still very much is actually, especially at the editorial level, one thing you'll notice is that there are a lot of female reporters, but there are very few female editors, and that's still probably the case. But I think that's changing. I think it's getting better, I think there's progress in that area. Oh, yeah. Yeah, the first thing was, God, I don't even remember who, I guess it was Alternet. This website called me up and asked me to review my book, Spanking the Donkey. And that was the most fun review I ever wrote in my entire life. I ripped myself. And I was like, this book is the worst piece of shit ever written. And, and because I had written it, I knew what all its flaws were, and I was completely merciless about how, I set out to write this, very broad, sweeping indictment of something, and it ended up being just this story about this loser who couldn't get a story while he was stuck on John Kerry's plane for months after end, and was just whining for most of the book and didn't really accomplish anything. And I thought it was hilarious, and I tossed this thing off and sent it away. And next thing I know, I get a call from my publisher, like, dude, we're selling this book. And can you issue a retraction? I'm like, I don't know. I think that horse is out of that barn, So they, that book I wrote for a very small publisher called The New Press. And it's really funny. My next publisher was an imprint of Random House, and before I signed that deal, they made me explicitly promise not to review my own work at any time in the future. So that was really, really funny. And Thomas Friedman, I've been obsessed with Thomas Friedman for a long time, and this dates back to when I was in Russia. There was a period where I had a really serious drug problem in the late 90s. I was doing a lot of speed, and I was up a lot late at night, and there's an 8-hour time difference in between Russia and New York. And I got it into my head that I was gonna, I kept getting on the phone in the middle of the night and calling up people in the New York Times and pretending to be Tom Friedman. And I would call up Arthur Sulzberger, who's like the publisher of the New York Times, and I'd be like, get the fuck out of my parking space, you know, this is freedom. And golf is off this weekend, all this stuff. And I would call all these people. I have no idea what kind of an effect that had on his life, but I remember when I kind of like got clean a couple of years later. You know, it was one of those sort of happy, you know, post-drug stories where, you know, I'm like jogging now and, you know, making salads for myself, and you know, taking in the fresh air and everything. And then all of a sudden I had this like terrible memory of like calling up Tom Friedman's bosses on the telephone for months and months on end. I was like, my God, did I actually do that? You know? But Friedman to me represents everything that's like evil about American journalism, and he's kind of, you know, he's you know, I talk to a lot of people about this guy, and I think the thing that's worst about him is that he has no idea what a big effect he has on the world. You know, I see congressmen and senators who are reading his work every single day and taking him seriously as a major authority on world events. And you know, his basic point of view is that you know, capitalism is good in every place, no matter what the costs. And you know, if Israel wants to bomb kids, they should, because that'll make the Palestinians think twice about doing whatever it is they want. And he just kind of tosses this stuff off the top of his head and puts it out there in the New York Times, and I think really doesn't think about the consequences. In addition to that, he's, you know, a sort of hilarious trafficker in malapropisms that maybe only George Bush is his rival, you know. And so I really, actually, when his books come out, I really look forward to it, because I know I'm going to get to write a review about it, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So probably the answer is never, you know.